When my daughter-in-law squeezed my hand under the mahogany dining table and whispered those words to me, something inside my chest went cold. "Don't talk too much. You embarrass us." The laughter that followed from my own family felt like glass breaking in my ears. I had spent 3 hours that afternoon preparing my famous sweet potato casserole, the one that used to make my late husband smile every Thanksgiving. I had ironed my best burgundy dress, the one I wore to church on special occasions, and I had driven 45 minutes through traffic to be here for what I thought was a celebration of family. But as I sat there, watching my son Marcus avoid my eyes, while his wife Jennifer's perfectly manicured fingers pressed into my weathered hand, I realized I was not here as family. I was here as an obligation, a burden they tolerated because blood demanded it. The dining room was filled with Jennifer's relatives, people I had met only briefly at the wedding 2 years ago, people who spoke in hushed tones about their stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. I was the only one at that table who remembered what it felt like to count every dollar, to work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, to sacrifice everything so your child could have opportunities you never had. 25 years, I had worked as a night shift nurse at City General Hospital. 25 years of double shifts, of missing sleep, of coming home with aching feet and hands that smelled like disinfectant. All so Marcus could go to medical school. All so he could become the successful cardiologist sitting across from me now. The one who was pretending not to hear his wife's cruel words. The one who used to call me his hero when he was struggling through his residency, and I would send him money I could barely afford to spare. I picked up my teacup, the delicate china that Jennifer had insisted on using instead of the sturdy mugs I was comfortable with, and I took a slow sip. The Earl Grey was bitter on my tongue, or maybe that was just the taste of disappointment. Around me, the conversation continued, as if nothing had happened. Jennifer's father was telling a story about his golf game. Her brother was complaining about the stock market, and her mother was running late as usual. They spoke over me, around me, through me, as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to be occupying space at their table. This was not the first time Jennifer had made me feel small. There was the time she had corrected my grammar in front of their friends, explaining that I had never had the benefit of a proper education. There was the Christmas when she had re-wrapped the gifts I had brought for the grandchildren, replacing my humble wrapping paper with her expensive designer patterns because mine was not sophisticated enough for the family photos. There was the birthday party, where she had seated me at the children's table, claiming there was not enough room with the adults, while a chair remained empty next to Marcus all evening. But tonight felt different. Tonight, surrounded by strangers who barely acknowledged my presence, I felt the full weight of how far my son had drifted from the boy I had raised. The boy who used to defend me when his father would come home, drunk and angry. The boy who had promised me that when he became successful, he would never forget where he came from. The boy who had held my hand at his father's funeral and sworn that we would always be a team, him and me against the world. I looked around the table at these people who had never struggled, who had never wondered if they could afford groceries and rent in the same month, who had never worked 16-hour days just to survive. They lived in a world I had only glimpsed from the outside, a world of country club memberships and private schools, of summer homes and designer handbags. And somehow, my son had become one of them, adopting not just their lifestyle, but their attitude toward people like me. people like the woman who had raised him. The irony was not lost on me. I had sacrificed everything to give Marcus access to this world, never imagining that once he entered it, he would lock the door behind him and leave me standing outside. I had worked myself to the bone so he could attend medical conferences in Paris and drive luxury cars and live in a house with more bedrooms than I had windows. I had done without so he could have everything, never thinking that everything would not include space for his mother. Jennifer was describing her latest charity gala, the one where she had raised money for underprivileged children. The same woman who had just told me to be quiet because I embarrassed her was now speaking passionately about helping disadvantaged youth. She used words like outreach and empowerment, words that sounded hollow, coming from someone who could not show basic respect to the woman who had raised her husband. I wondered if she saw the contradiction, if any of them could see the absurdity of the situation. My phone buzzed softly in my purse, probably a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, asking how dinner was going. Mrs. Patterson had been my friend for over 15 years, ever since I had moved into the little house on Maple Street after my husband died. She was the one who had helped me plant the garden in my backyard, who had sat with me through countless nights when I was grieving, who had celebrated with me when Marcus graduated from medical school. She knew the real story of my life, the struggles and the victories, the pride and the heartbreak of raising a child alone while working impossible hours. I thought about Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, where I was always welcome, where my stories mattered, where my voice was heard and valued. I thought about our Sunday dinners, simple meals of fried chicken and cornbread, where laughter was genuine and love was unconditional. I thought about the book club we had started with the ladies from church, where we would discuss novels and share our thoughts without fear of being judged or corrected. That was home. This sterile dining room, with its expensive artwork and fresh flowers that had no scent, was just a place I was visiting. The front door chimed, and Jennifer's face lit up with relief. "That must be Mother," she announced, already rising from her chair. I was starting to worry she wouldn't make it. Everyone turned toward the entryway, expecting to see the elegant older woman I had met briefly at the wedding, the one who had looked through me as if I were invisible even then. I prepared myself for another evening of being overlooked, another few hours of sitting quietly, while more important people filled the air with their important conversations. But when Jennifer returned with her mother, something in the atmosphere shifted. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, swept into the dining room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Her perfectly styled silver hair caught the light from the chandelier, and her jewelry glittered as she moved. She was every inch the society matron, the kind of woman who appeared in newspaper social pages and charity event photographs. She began her rounds of greetings, air-kissing her way around the table, making small talk about traffic and her book club meeting that had run late. Her voice carried that particular cadence of privilege, each word carefully enunciated and delivered with the assurance of someone who had never been told to be quiet, who had never been made to feel that her thoughts were unwelcome or her presence was an embarrassment. When she reached my corner of the table, I expected the same polite but distant acknowledgement I had received from everyone else. I was prepared for the brief handshake, the forced smile, the quick pivot to someone more interesting. Instead, she stopped abruptly, her pale blue eyes widening with what I could only describe as shock. Her carefully composed expression crumbled, replaced by something that looked almost like fear, Margaret Washington? Ah, she whispered, her voice so quiet that only I could hear it at first. Margaret Washington from Channel 7 News. The table continued its conversations, unaware that anything significant was happening in our little corner. But I felt my heart begin to race, because Elizabeth Thornton had just spoken a name I had not heard in over 30 years, a name that belonged to a different life, a different version of myself, a time when I was not just Marcus's mother, or the night shift nurse, or the woman who should be quiet so she would not embarrass anyone. I met her gaze steadily, seeing the recognition dawn in her eyes, watching as she processed the impossible reality of who was sitting at her daughter's dinner table. The woman she was looking at was not the same person who had appeared on television screens across the city 3 decades ago. But some things never change completely. Some things leave marks that time cannot erase. "Hello, Elizabeth," I said quietly, my voice calm despite the storm building in my chest. "It has been a very long time." The color drained from her face, and I watched as she struggled to maintain her composure. Around us, the dinner conversation continued, but I could see the wheels turning in Elizabeth Thornton's mind, could see her calculating the implications of this unexpected encounter. She knew who I was. More importantly, she knew who I had been. More importantly, she knew who I had been. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she gripped the back of an empty chair, and I could see the exact moment when 32 years collapsed into nothing. She was remembering that night in November 1991, when a young black woman named Margaret Washington had stood outside the courthouse steps with a microphone in her hand and cameras rolling, asking the questions that nobody else dared to ask. She was remembering the story that had brought down her husband's construction company and sent 3 city council members to federal prison. The same story that had cost me everything. "You look well," Elizabeth managed, though her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her shock. She was trying to process how the investigative journalist, who had once been the most feared reporter in the city, was now sitting quietly at her daughter's dinner table, being told not to speak because she might embarrass someone. I had been 28 years old then, fresh out of journalism school and hungry to make a difference. The city was drowning in corruption, with construction contracts being handed out like party favors to the mayor's friends, while schools crumbled and bridges fell apart. I had spent months following paper trails, interviewing whistleblowers, building a case that would expose the web of bribery and kickbacks that connected the mayor's office to some of the city's most prominent families. The Thornton Construction Company had been at the center of it all. Elizabeth's late husband, William Thornton, had built his empire on city contracts that he had never fairly competed for. Roads that were supposed to last 20 years were falling apart after 5. The new community center had been built with substandard materials that made it unsafe for children. The bridge renovation project had been so poorly executed that it had to be completely redone within 3 years, costing taxpayers millions more than the original contract. But William Thornton had friends in high places, friends who made sure his bids were always accepted, friends who made sure inspectors looked the other way when his crews cut corners, friends who made sure anyone who asked too many questions would find themselves facing consequences. I had asked too many questions. The story I broke had run for 6 consecutive nights on Channel 7's evening news. I had documentation, recorded conversations, photographs of meetings that were supposed to be secret. I had testimony from construction workers who had been forced to use inferior materials, from city inspectors who had been pressured to approve work they knew was dangerous. From accountants who had been told to hide money transfers that would have revealed the scope of the conspiracy. The investigation had earned me a Peabody Award and destroyed my career in the same year. Elizabeth was still staring at me, probably wondering how the woman who had once commanded television studios and press conferences was now sitting silently, while her daughter-in-law told her to keep quiet. She was probably trying to reconcile the Margaret Washington, who had never backed down from the most powerful men in the city, with the woman who was letting herself be treated like an unwelcome guest at her own son's dinner table. What she could not know, what none of them could know, was the price I had paid for telling the truth. 3 weeks after my final report aired, I had been called into my news director's office and told that budget cuts were forcing them to eliminate my position. It was nothing personal, they assured me, just business decisions that had to be made. But I knew better. The same powerful interests that I had exposed had made phone calls, applied pressure, called in favors. The television station had been quietly purchased by a media company with ties to the very people I had investigated. No other news station in the city would hire me. Suddenly, the award-winning journalist with the impeccable reputation had become radioactive. My agent stopped returning my calls. The book deal I had been negotiating disappeared overnight. The speaking engagements that had been booked months in advance were mysteriously canceled. Within 6 months, I was working as a waitress at an all-night diner, trying to figure out how to pay rent on my one-bedroom apartment. The journalism career I had worked my entire life to build had evaporated as if it had never existed. The powerful people I had exposed had made sure that Margaret Washington, the reporter, would never work in media again. That was when I met Marcus's father, James, a kind man who worked construction and did not care about my past or my fall from grace. He saw a woman who was struggling and offered friendship that slowly grew into love. When I became pregnant with Marcus, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would put my journalism career behind me and focus on being the best mother I could be. I went back to school and became a nurse, a profession where I could help people without needing to depend on the approval of powerful men who held grudges. I buried Margaret Washington so completely that even I sometimes forgot she had ever existed. For 32 years, I had been just Margaret Johnson, Marcus's mother, James's widow, the night shift nurse who worked extra hours to pay for her son's education. But Elizabeth Thornton remembered. She remembered the young woman who had stood in front of cameras and refused to be intimidated, who had asked the questions that brought down her family's fortune and sent her husband to federal prison for 18 months. She remembered the investigation that had cost her family millions of dollars in lost contracts and legal fees, that had forced them to sell their estate and downsize their lifestyle, that had made the Thornton name synonymous with corruption for years afterward. She remembered, and now she was looking at me with the same mixture of fear and hatred that I had seen in her husband's eyes during his perp walk all those years ago. "I did not realize you were still in the city," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. Around us, the dinner conversation continued, everyone else still oblivious to the tension crackling between us, like electricity. "I never left," I replied simply. "I have been here the whole time." What I did not say was that I had watched from a distance as the Thornton family slowly rebuilt their fortune. Elizabeth had been smart, patient, careful. She had distanced herself from the construction business and moved into real estate, then into charitable foundations, gradually rehabilitating the family name through strategic philanthropy and social connections. She had remarried well after William's death, choosing a man whose reputation could help wash away the stains of the past. But she had never forgotten the woman who had exposed her first husband's crimes. And now that woman was sitting at her daughter's dinner table, married to her grandchildren's uncle, woven into her family in ways that must have made her blood run cold. I could see her mind working, calculating the implications of this discovery. Did I know who Jennifer was when Marcus started dating her? Had I planned this somehow, orchestrated this connection as some kind of delayed revenge? Was I gathering information about their family, looking for new stories to tell, new secrets to expose? The truth was far simpler and far more painful. I had not known who Jennifer's family was until the wedding, and by then it was too late to say anything without causing problems for Marcus. I had recognized Elizabeth immediately at the ceremony, but she had looked right through me. Just another middle-aged black woman in a church full of people she considered beneath her notice. I had kept my mouth shut then, and I had kept it shut for 2 years, since, watching my son marry into the family of people who had destroyed my first career, watching him adopt their values and their attitude toward people like me. The irony was so bitter, it made my throat close up sometimes when I thought about it too much. Marcus had no idea that his mother had once been one of the most respected investigative journalists in the state. He knew I had worked in television before he was born, but I had always told him I was just a secretary, someone who answered phones and filed papers. He had no idea that the comfortable middle-class life he remembered from childhood had been built on the ashes of dreams I had sacrificed to keep him safe from the consequences of my past. Elizabeth was still staring at me, her face pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. She knew that with one conversation, I could shatter the carefully constructed world she had built for her family. I could tell Marcus who his wife's grandmother really was, could explain the history that connected us, could reveal the corruption that had built the foundation of their fortune. But I would not do that, not because she deserved my silence, but because Marcus deserved to be happy, even if his happiness came at the cost of my own dignity. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of shared history and unspoken threats. Around us, the dinner conversation flowed on, everyone else completely unaware that 2 women were locked in a battle of wills that had been 32 years in the making. Finally, Elizabeth seemed to remember where she was. She straightened her shoulders, forced a smile back onto her face, and moved to take her seat at the head of the table. But I caught the way her hands shook slightly as she unfolded her napkin, the way her eyes kept darting back to me as if she expected me to suddenly announce my identity to the entire gathering. Jennifer was asking her mother about her book club, about the charity luncheon she was planning, about normal family things that normal families discussed over dinner. But I could see Elizabeth struggling to focus, could see her mind racing as she tried to process this impossible situation. The woman who had destroyed her first husband was sitting at her daughter's table, being told to keep quiet so she would not embarrass anyone. The journalist who had once commanded press conferences and interviewed senators was now just the mother-in-law who did not quite fit in, whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. And in that moment, I realized that Elizabeth Thornton was more terrified of me than I had ever been of her. Of her, she was afraid because she understood something that my own family did not. She knew that the quiet woman they had been dismissing all evening was not who they thought she was. She knew that beneath the surface of the humble nurse who worked night shifts and made sweet potato casseroles lived someone who had once brought down empires with nothing but a microphone in the truth. But what terrified her most was not knowing what I planned to do with that power. The conversation at the table had shifted to discussing vacation plans. Jennifer was describing their upcoming trip to Martha's Vineyard, the same island where her grandmother, Elizabeth, maintained a summer cottage. Marcus was nodding along, adding details about the sailing lessons he wanted to take, the restaurants they planned to visit. These were people who planned their leisure time with the same careful attention that I had once planned my investigations. I sipped my tea and listened to them talk about a world that existed in magazines and movies for people like me. They discussed which yacht club had the better tennis courts, which private beach was less crowded with tourists, which restaurants required reservations months in advance. Their problems were things like whether the house they were renting had enough bedrooms for all their guests, or if the wine cellar would be properly stocked. Meanwhile, I was calculating in my head whether I could afford to fix the leak in my roof before winter came, whether I should take on extra shifts at the hospital to help cover Marcus's student loan payments that he was still struggling with, despite his successful practice. The same student loans I had co-signed because I believed in his dreams. The same debt that kept me working at 72 years old when other women my age were enjoying retirement. Elizabeth kept glancing at me throughout the meal, her discomfort growing more obvious with each passing minute. She was probably wondering if I had orchestrated this entire relationship somehow, if I had targeted her family for some elaborate, long-term revenge plot. The reality was far more mundane and far more painful. I had simply fallen through the cracks of a system that punished truth-tellers and rewarded those who could afford to bury their mistakes. Jennifer's brother David was talking about his latest business venture, something involving cryptocurrency and blockchain technology that I did not pretend to understand. He used phrases like market disruption and scalable solutions, speaking with the confidence of someone who had never worried about whether his ideas would put food on the table. His wife nodded along admiringly, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood his business better than I understood my own son's medical practice. This was the world Marcus had married into, a world where money talked and everything else whispered, a world where success was measured in stock portfolios and property values, where influence meant knowing the right people at the right country clubs, where problems could be solved with checkbooks and connections. It was the same world that had destroyed my journalism career 32 years ago, the same network of wealth and power that had decided my truth-telling was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. I thought about the young woman I had been, the one who had believed that good reporting could change the world. She had been so naive, so convinced that facts and evidence would always triumph over money and influence. She had not understood that the system was designed to protect itself, that people like William Thornton had layers of insulation between themselves and consequences, that someone like me could be erased as easily as deleting a computer file. But that young woman had also been fearless in ways that surprised me even now. She had walked into rooms full of powerful men and asked questions they did not want to answer. She had followed paper trails that led to some of the most influential families in the state. She had looked corruption in the face and refused to blink first. That woman still lived somewhere inside me, buried under decades of compromise and silence, but not dead, never dead. Elizabeth was telling a story about her garden club, how they were planning to beautify the park downtown with new flower beds and walking paths. She spoke about civic improvement and community engagement, using the same language of public service that her first husband had used when he was stealing millions of dollars from city contracts. The irony was so thick I could taste it, but no one else at the table seemed to notice. Jennifer was asking about the timeline for the park project, whether it would be finished before their wedding anniversary party in the spring. She wanted to use the park as a backdrop for photographs, something elegant and sophisticated that would look good in the social pages of the newspaper. Everything in their lives was performative, designed to project an image of success and respectability. I remembered when success had meant something different to me. Success had been getting the story right, asking the tough questions, holding powerful people accountable for their actions. Success had been the phone call from a city council member's whistleblowing secretary, or the moment when a source finally trusted me enough to hand over the documents that would crack a case wide open. Success had been knowing that my work mattered, that it made a difference in people's lives. Now, success was supposed to be sitting quietly at this table, not embarrassing my son's wife, fitting into a world that had never wanted me in the first place. Success was supposed to be grateful for the invitation, thankful for the opportunity to share a meal with people who barely acknowledged my existence. But Elizabeth's recognition had changed something in the air, shifted the power dynamic in ways that nobody else could see. She knew who I really was, and that knowledge made her vulnerable in a way she had not expected. She had spent decades rebuilding her family's reputation, carefully crafting an image of respectability and philanthropy. The last thing she needed was for old scandals to resurface, for people to start asking questions about how the Thornton fortune had been rebuilt. Marcus was describing his latest medical conference, a gathering in San Francisco, where he had presented a paper on innovative cardiac procedures. He spoke with genuine passion about his work, and for a moment, I could see the boy I had raised, the one who had wanted to help people, who had dreamed of making the world better through medicine. That boy still existed inside the man who now lived in this rarefied world of privilege and status. But that boy would be horrified to know how his mother was being treated at his table. The Marcus had raised would never have allowed his wife to tell me to keep quiet, would never have sat silently while I was made to feel unwelcome in my own family. Somewhere along the way, he had learned to prioritize keeping peace with his wife over defending his mother, had decided that my comfort was less important than maintaining harmony in his marriage. I understood the calculation he had made, even if it broke my heart. Jennifer came from a world he wanted to be part of, a world that could open doors for his career and his children's futures. I was a reminder of where he had come from, of the struggles and sacrifices that had gotten him here. It was easier to minimize my presence than to confront the uncomfortable truths about how far he had traveled from his roots. Elizabeth was watching me again, probably trying to read my intentions in my expression. She had to be wondering what I planned to do with the information I possessed, whether I was gathering new material for some future expose, whether I was biding my time before revealing secrets that could destroy the carefully constructed life her family had built. The truth was, I had no plans for revenge. I had learned long ago that the powerful protected their own, that individual acts of defiance rarely changed systemic problems. The corruption I had exposed in 1991 had been replaced by new forms of corruption, carried out by different players, but following the same basic patterns. Taking down William Thornton had not reformed the system. It had just taught the system to be more careful about covering its tracks. But Elizabeth did not know that. She only knew that the woman who had once been capable of destroying her family was sitting at her daughter's dinner table, and that made her afraid. Fear, I had learned, was a powerful motivator. It made people reveal their true natures, stripped away the polite facades they wore in public. Elizabeth Thornton was afraid, and that fear was making her reassess everything she thought she knew about this family dinner, about her daughter's marriage, about the risks and vulnerabilities in her carefully ordered world. Jennifer was serving dessert now, an elaborate tiramisu that she had ordered from some expensive bakery downtown. She served everyone else first, leaving me for last as if I were an afterthought, a minor guest whose preferences did not matter much. The dessert was beautiful and probably delicious, but it tasted like obligation in my mouth, like something I was supposed to be grateful for, even though it came with conditions and expectations attached. I thought about the desserts I used to make for Marcus when he was growing up. Simple things like chocolate cake from a box mix, or apple pie made with fruit from the tree in our backyard. Those desserts had been made with love, not purchased to impress anyone, and they had tasted like home in ways that this perfect tiramisu never could. But Marcus seemed to enjoy the sophisticated dessert, praising Jennifer's choice and asking where she had found such an excellent bakery. He had learned to appreciate the finer things in life, had developed tastes that matched his new social status. There was nothing wrong with that, I told myself. I had worked hard to give him opportunities to experience a better life than the one I had known. What hurt was the growing sense that in gaining access to this world, he had lost something essential about himself. He had learned to value appearances over authenticity, status over substance, comfort over truth. He had become someone who could sit silently while his wife humiliated his mother, someone who prioritized social harmony over family loyalty. Elizabeth was declining the dessert, claiming she was watching her figure, but I could see her appetite had been destroyed by my unexpected presence. She kept looking at me as if I were a bomb that might explode at any moment, as if 32 years of silence could not be trusted to continue indefinitely. And maybe she was right to be worried. Maybe the woman who had once refused to be intimidated by powerful men was getting tired of being treated like an invisible servant at her own son's dinner table. Maybe the journalist who had built her career on asking uncomfortable questions was running out of patience with a family that preferred comfortable lies. The evening was winding down, and people were beginning to make polite noises about early meetings and long drives home. Elizabeth was among the first to announce her departure, suddenly remembering an important phone call she needed to make, an early appointment she had forgotten about. She was practically fleeing from the table, desperate to escape, before I might decide to say something that would shatter the illusion of respectability she had worked so hard to maintain. But I remained silent, finishing my dessert and folding my napkin as if this had been just another family dinner, as if nothing significant had happened, as if the most powerful woman in the room had not just recognized me as the person who had once brought down her entire world. Sometimes, I was learning, silence could be more threatening than words. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you could do was nothing at all, letting other people's fear and guilt fill in the spaces where accusations might have been. Elizabeth gathered her purse and coat, making hurried goodbyes around the table. When she reached me, she hesitated for just a moment, her eyes meeting mine with an expression that was equal parts terror and pleading. "It was lovely to meet you," she said, her voice carefully controlled, but her hands trembling slightly. "I hope we see each other again soon." I am sure we will, I replied calmly, my voice carrying implications she would spend the rest of the night trying to decode. After all, we are family now. The word family hung in the air between us, like a threat wrapped in silk, and I watched the color drain from her face as she realized the full implications of what I had just said. We were indeed family now, connected by marriage and blood in ways that could not be easily severed, bound together by relationships that would require ongoing contact and interaction. She could not simply make me disappear the way her first husband's powerful friends had made my journalism career disappear. I was woven into the fabric of her family's life now, present at every holiday gathering, every anniversary celebration, every important milestone, and as long as I remained part of this family, I would be a constant reminder of secrets she had hoped were buried forever. Elizabeth left without saying another word, practically running for the door, as if staying another moment might give me the opportunity to reveal something she could not afford to have known. I watched her go with the same calm expression I had maintained all evening, giving no indication of the storm of thoughts and emotions swirling beneath the surface. The other guests began departing as well, offering polite thanks for a lovely evening, making plans to get together again soon. Jennifer accepted their compliments and promises with the gracious smile of a perfect hostess, but I could see the tension around her eyes, could sense that she had noticed something strange in her mother's abrupt departure. Soon, it was just Marcus, Jennifer, and me at the table, surrounded by the debris of an elegant dinner that had revealed more than anyone had intended. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and unacknowledged tensions. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice carefully neutral in the way doctors learn to use when delivering difficult news to families. Mom, thank you for coming tonight. I know these family gatherings can be overwhelming sometimes. Overwhelming, as if my discomfort was simply a matter of social anxiety, as if the problem was my inability to adapt to their sophisticated world, rather than their inability to treat me with basic respect. As if the solution was for me to try harder to fit in, rather than for them to examine how they had been treating me. It was an interesting evening, I replied, choosing my words as carefully as he had chosen his. Very educational. Jennifer was clearing plates with sharp, efficient movements that betrayed her irritation. She had planned this dinner to show off her family, to demonstrate her status and sophistication, and somehow it had gone wrong in ways she could not quite identify. Her mother had left early and upset. There had been strange undercurrents of tension she could not understand, and something about the evening felt incomplete and unsatisfying. I hope you enjoyed meeting everyone, she said, without looking at me directly. Mother seemed a little tired tonight, but she does so much with her charity work and social commitments. She was fishing for information, trying to understand what had passed between her mother and me, why Elizabeth had suddenly become so eager to leave. But I had no intention of enlightening her. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Some secrets were too explosive to reveal without careful planning and perfect timing. Your mother seems like a very accomplished woman, I said mildly. I imagine she has many interesting stories from her years of community involvement. The words were innocent enough on the surface, but I could see Jennifer trying to read between the lines, sensing there was more being communicated than the simple compliment I had offered. She was intelligent enough to recognize subtext, even when she could not decode its meaning. Marcus was looking between us with the confused expression of someone who sensed tension but could not identify its source. He had inherited his father's straightforward nature, a tendency to take things at face value that had served him well in medicine, but left him poorly equipped to navigate the subtle power games that governed social relationships in his wife's world. "We should probably start cleaning up," Jennifer announced, beginning to stack dishes with more force than necessary. "Some of us have early meetings tomorrow." It was a dismissal disguised as practicality, a way of ending the evening without having to acknowledge the uncomfortable dynamics that had made it less than perfect. I recognized the technique from my journalism days. The way guilty parties would suddenly discover urgent business that required their immediate attention whenever questioning got too close to sensitive topics. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 72 years in the stiffness of my joints after sitting for so long. The elegant dining room chair had not been designed for comfort, just like this family dinner had not been designed for my actual inclusion. Everything about the evening had been performative, an elaborate show of family unity that excluded the very people it claimed to embrace. "Thank you for dinner," I said to Jennifer, maintaining the polite fiction that I had been a welcome guest rather than an obligation they had grudgingly fulfilled. "The food was lovely." Marcus walked me to the door, helping me with my coat in a gesture of courtesy that reminded me of the boy I had raised, the one who had been taught to respect his elders and care for those who had sacrificed for him. For a moment, I could see past the successful cardiologist to the child who had once promised never to forget where he came from. "Drive carefully, Mom," he said, giving me a brief hug that felt more like duty than affection. "We'll talk soon." We both knew that soon was a polite fiction, that our next conversation would probably be the obligatory phone call on my birthday, or the next holiday gathering where my presence was required but not desired. He had learned to manage our relationship like a medical appointment, scheduled and brief, designed to meet minimum requirements without causing complications in his real life. But as I drove away from their beautiful house in their beautiful neighborhood, I found myself smiling for the first time all evening. Elizabeth Thornton's terrified face was burned into my memory, along with the delicious knowledge that the woman who had once helped destroy my career was now afraid of what I might do to hers. I had spent 32 years believing that my silence was weakness, that my decision to disappear and rebuild my life under a new identity had been surrender. But tonight, I had learned something different. Tonight, I had discovered that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply exist. Simply be present in spaces where your enemies thought they were safe. Simply remind them that the past was not as buried as they had hoped. Elizabeth Thornton was going to spend the rest of the night wondering what I knew, what I was planning, what I might reveal, and to whom. She was going to lie awake, calculating risks and vulnerabilities, trying to figure out how to protect herself from a threat she could not quite define. And I was going to go home to my little house on Maple Street, make myself a cup of real tea in a sturdy mug, and think about what Margaret Washington might have done with this unexpected opportunity that had just fallen into her lap. The drive home through the quiet suburban streets gave me time to process what had just happened. Streetlights cast long shadows across manicured lawns, illuminating houses where other families were probably finishing their own dinners, having their own conversations, dealing with their own complicated relationships. But none of them, I was certain, had just experienced what I had experienced tonight. Mrs. Patterson's porch light was on when I pulled into my driveway, a warm yellow glow that meant she was probably still awake, probably reading one of her mystery novels while waiting to hear how my evening had gone. She had been skeptical when I told her about the dinner invitation, had wondered aloud why Jennifer would suddenly want to include me in such an elaborate gathering after 2 years of barely tolerating my presence at family events. I should have listened to her instincts. Mrs. Patterson had a way of reading people that came from decades of experience as a social worker, years of sitting across from families in crisis, and learning to recognize the signs of dysfunction hiding behind polite facades. She had taken one look at Jennifer during their brief meeting at Marcus's birthday party last year and declared her to be the kind of woman who smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. But I had wanted so desperately to believe that things were changing, that Jennifer was making an effort to include me, that my relationship with Marcus might be healing. I had convinced myself that the formal dinner invitation meant progress, that perhaps she had finally realized how much I meant to her husband, how much I had sacrificed to help him become the man he was today. Instead, I had been invited as a prop in someone else's performance, a way for Jennifer to demonstrate her magnanimity by including the difficult mother-in-law, the woman from the wrong side of town who did not quite fit, but who had to be tolerated because of family obligations. I had been there to make her look good, to show her friends and family what a generous person she was, how graciously she dealt with her husband's less sophisticated relatives. The humiliation of that realization should have been crushing. For most of the evening, it had been crushing, but Elizabeth Thornton's recognition had changed everything, had shifted the power dynamic in ways that were still rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the familiar comfort of my own space, breathing in the scent of the vanilla candles I had lit before leaving, the lingering aroma of the coffee I had made that morning. This was home in ways that Marcus's elegant dining room would never be, filled with furniture I had chosen, photographs I had taken, memories I had created through decades of honest living. The answering machine was blinking with 2 messages. The first was from my supervisor at the hospital, asking if I could pick up an extra shift tomorrow night because one of the other nurses had called in sick. The second was from my sister in Atlanta, checking in about the dinner and wanting to know how things had gone with Marcus's fancy in-laws. Both messages represented the real world I inhabited, the world of people who worked for their money and worried about their responsibilities, who understood that relationships required effort and sacrifice, who measured success by how well they treated the people they loved, rather than by how much they could spend on dinner parties. I made myself that cup of tea I had been thinking about, using my favorite mug, the one with the chip on the handle that Marcus had made in a pottery class when he was 12 years old. He had been so proud of that mug, had insisted I use it every morning for my coffee, had beamed with pleasure whenever he saw me drinking from something he had created with his own hands. That boy seemed like a stranger now, someone who existed only in photographs and memories. The man he had become would probably be embarrassed by the imperfect mug, would suggest I replace it with something more sophisticated, something that better reflected the image he was trying to project. But I treasured the mug precisely because of its imperfections, because it represented a time when my love had been enough, when my approval had mattered more than anyone else's opinion, when we had been a team against the world, rather than strangers sitting at opposite ends of someone else's dining room table. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one I had bought secondhand 20 years ago, and reupholstered myself when the original fabric had worn thin. It was not elegant like Jennifer's furniture, but it was comfortable in ways that expensive things rarely were, shaped by years of use into something that fit my body perfectly. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator, sounds that had become the soundtrack of my solitary life. I had grown accustomed to the silence over the years since James died, had learned to find peace in my own company, to appreciate the freedom that came with not having to consider anyone else's needs or preferences. But tonight, the silence felt different, charged with possibility in ways I had not experienced in decades. Tonight, I was not just Margaret Johnson, the retired nurse who lived alone and worried about her ungrateful son. Tonight, I was also Margaret Washington, the woman who had once commanded newsrooms and challenged corrupt officials, who had built a reputation on asking the questions no one else dared to ask. That woman had been dormant for so long that I had almost forgotten she existed. But Elizabeth Thornton's terrified recognition had awakened something that had been sleeping, had reminded me of who I used to be before I learned to make myself smaller, before I accepted that my voice did not matter, before I decided that keeping peace was more important than demanding respect. I thought about the investigation that had brought down William Thornton and his network of corrupt associates. It had taken months of careful work, following paper trails and cultivating sources, building a case that was so airtight that even the most expensive lawyers could not find ways to dispute it. The work had been methodical, patient, thorough, in ways that had ultimately made it impossible to ignore or dismiss. That investigation had destroyed my career, but it had also sent 3 men to prison and recovered millions of dollars in stolen taxpayer money. It had changed city policies and ended corrupt practices that had been bleeding the community for years. It had mattered in ways that went beyond personal cost, had made a difference in the lives of ordinary people who deserved better from their government. The woman who had done that work was still inside me, somewhere, still capable of the same careful research and strategic thinking that had made her formidable 32 years ago. The question was whether she had any reason to wake up after so many years of sleep. I sipped my tea and considered the possibilities. Elizabeth Thornton had rebuilt her family's fortune through careful investments in real estate and strategic charitable giving, had rehabilitated their reputation through decades of public service and social contributions. She had married well the second time, choosing a man whose own reputation could help wash away the stains of her first husband's crimes. But fortunes built on respectability were fragile things, dependent on maintaining appearances and avoiding scrutiny. The Thornton name was now associated with philanthropy and civic leadership, rather than corruption and fraud. But that transformation had required constant vigilance and careful management. Any reminder of the family's criminal past could undo years of reputation rehabilitation. Elizabeth understood this vulnerability better than anyone. She had spent decades constructing a new identity for her family, building relationships with influential people who could help her maintain her social position, cultivating an image of respectability that was essential to her continued success. The last thing she needed was for old scandals to resurface, for people to start asking questions about how the Thornton fortune had been rebuilt. My presence at that dinner table represented a threat she had never anticipated. I was a living reminder of her family's criminal past, someone who possessed detailed knowledge of their corruption, someone who had already proven capable of bringing them down once before. Worse yet, I was now connected to her family through marriage, woven into their lives in ways that meant I could not simply be ignored or avoided. The possibilities were intriguing, not for revenge, exactly, but for justice, for accountability, for the kind of truth-telling that I had once believed could change the world. I finished my tea and went to the spare bedroom that I had converted into a home office years ago. The room was filled with books and papers, the accumulated detritus of a lifetime of reading and learning, of staying informed about the world, even after I was no longer reporting on it. But tucked away in the back of the closet was a file cabinet I had not opened in years, filled with documents and notes from my journalism career. The Thornton files were in the bottom drawer, wrapped in plastic and stored in acid-free boxes to preserve them from deterioration. I had told myself I was keeping them for historical purposes, as evidence of important work I had done, as proof that my career had mattered, even if it had ended badly. But looking at them now, I realized I had been keeping them for exactly this moment, for the day when the story might become relevant again. The files were extensive, covering not just William Thornton's construction company, but the entire network of corruption that had connected City Hall to some of the most prominent families in the state. There were financial records, photographs of secret meetings, transcripts of recorded conversations, testimony from whistleblowers who had risked their careers to tell the truth. But there were also gaps in the story, threads I had never been able to follow, connections I had suspected but never been able to prove. The investigation had been shut down before I could explore every lead, before I could answer every question that had emerged from my initial reporting. I spread the documents across my desk, feeling a familiar excitement as patterns began to emerge from the chaos of information. This was what I had been good at, this careful analysis of complex data, this ability to see connections that others missed. It was like solving a puzzle, except the stakes were real, and the consequences mattered to people's lives. The most interesting files were the ones labeled unanswered questions, filled with leads I had never been able to pursue, sources I had never been able to interview, documents I had never been able to obtain. Some of those questions might still be answerable, especially if I now had access to people and information that had been closed to me 32 years ago. Elizabeth Thornton, for example, had been largely protected during the original investigation by her husband's lawyers and her own careful distance from the day-to-day operations of the construction company. She had been interviewed once by prosecutors, had testified briefly before a grand jury, but had successfully maintained that she knew nothing about her husband's criminal activities. But I had always suspected there was more to the story. Financial records suggested that Elizabeth had been involved in several of the real estate transactions that had been used to launder money from the corrupt construction contracts. Bank records showed large transfers between accounts she controlled and shell companies that had been used to hide the flow of illegal payments. The problem had been proving her knowledge and intent. Her lawyers had successfully argued that she was an innocent spouse who had trusted her husband to handle their business affairs, that she had signed documents without understanding their true purpose, that she had been a victim of his deception rather than a willing participant in his crimes. That defense had been plausible in 1991, when women were often excluded from their husbands' business dealings and could credibly claim ignorance about financial matters. But it had never sat right with me, had never matched what I knew about Elizabeth Thornton's intelligence and sophistication, her active involvement in social and charitable organizations that required significant organizational and financial skills. I had suspected then that she knew much more than she admitted, that she had been a willing partner in her husband's corruption, rather than an innocent victim. But I had never been able to prove it, had never been able to find the evidence that would have exposed her true role in the conspiracy. Now, 32 years later, with Elizabeth established as a successful businesswoman and philanthropist in her own right, those old suspicions seemed worth revisiting. The woman who had rebuilt the Thornton fortune so skillfully, who had navigated complex business deals and charitable foundations with such expertise, was clearly not the naive housewife she had pretended to be during her husband's trial. I made notes as I reviewed the files, identifying questions that might still be answerable, connections that might still be traceable, sources who might still be alive and willing to talk. The work was absorbing in ways I had forgotten, engaging my mind in ways that nursing, despite its importance and satisfaction, had never quite managed to do. The clock on my desk showed that it was past midnight when I finally looked up from the documents. I had been working for hours without realizing it, lost in the familiar rhythm of investigation and analysis. My neck was stiff from bending over papers. My eyes were tired from reading in lamplight. But I felt more energized than I had in years. This was who I used to be. This careful researcher who could disappear for hours into complex problems, who could see patterns and connections that others missed. Margaret Washington had been good at this work, had been respected for her thoroughness and insight, had been feared by corrupt officials because she was relentless in pursuing the truth. That woman was still here, still capable of the same analytical thinking and strategic planning that had made her reputation. The question was what she planned to do with the opportunity that had just presented itself. I carefully returned the documents to their files, but I left several folders on my desk, the ones most relevant to Elizabeth Thornton and her current business interests. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful work of updating my research, of learning what the Thornton family had been doing for the past 3 decades, of identifying the vulnerabilities in their carefully constructed new life. Not for revenge, I told myself, for justice, for accountability, for the truth that had been buried under years of legal maneuvering and public relations campaigns. But as I turned off the lamp and headed to bed, I could not deny the satisfaction I felt at the thought of Elizabeth Thornton lying awake in her expensive bedroom, wondering what I knew and what I planned to do about it. She had spent the evening looking at me as if I were a bomb that might explode at any moment, and perhaps she was right to be worried. Perhaps it was time for Margaret Washington to remind the world that some stories never really end. They just wait for the right moment to continue. The next morning brought gray skies and the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look muted and sad. I had slept better than I had in months, despite staying up late with the files, despite the emotional intensity of the evening. There was something energizing about having a purpose again, about feeling like my skills and experience might actually matter for something more than just getting through another day. Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door while I was having my morning coffee, appearing on my porch with an umbrella and the expectant expression of someone who had been waiting all night to hear about the dinner party. "Well," she said, as soon as I opened the door, "how did it go with the Fancy family?" I invited her in for coffee, grateful for her company and her genuine interest in my life. Mrs. Patterson had been asking about my well-being for 15 years, had never once made me feel like my problems were unimportant or my feelings were invalid. She was the kind of friend everyone deserved to have, someone who cared about your happiness without expecting anything in return. It was educational, I told her, using the same word I had used with Marcus the night before. I learned some interesting things about Jennifer's family. Mrs. Patterson settled into the kitchen chair she had claimed as her own over the years, stirring sugar into her coffee with the practiced ease of someone who had shared countless mornings in this room. She had an intuitive understanding of when to push for details and when to let me tell my story at my own pace. "That Jennifer still treating you like the hired help?" she asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter in her characteristic way. "Worse," I admitted. "She told me not to talk too much because I would embarrass them." Right there, at the dinner table, in front of everyone. Mrs. Patterson's expression darkened. She had never liked Jennifer, had declared her to be fake as a $3 bill after their first meeting, had warned me that women like that only cared about appearances and status. But even she seemed shocked by the blatant disrespect Jennifer had shown. "That girl has no home training," she said, shaking her head in disgust. "And what did Marcus do about it?" "Nothing," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "He just sat there and let it happen." We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, both of us processing the implications of what I had shared. Mrs. Patterson had raised 3 children of her own, had experienced the complex dynamics of watching them grow up and create their own families, had navigated the delicate balance between staying involved in their lives and giving them space to make their own decisions. But she had also taught me that there were limits to how much disrespect a parent should tolerate, that love did not require accepting abuse, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was set boundaries and demand better treatment. Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. That dinner table humiliation was supposed to break me, supposed to put me in my place and remind me that I was nothing more than an obligation they had to tolerate. But instead, it woke up a part of myself I thought was dead forever. Elizabeth Thornton's terrified face, when she recognized me, was worth every cruel word Jennifer had spoken, every moment Marcus had sat silent while his wife tried to diminish me. They wanted me to be quiet, to stay small, to accept whatever scraps of respect they were willing to throw my way. But Margaret Washington was never quiet, and she's about to remind them why some people used to fear the sound of her voice. The past has a way of catching up with those who think they can bury it, and some stories are just waiting for the right moment to be told again.